Hello everyone, welcome to today's lesson. We'll be in the module of chemical monitoring and management, and we'll be studying ozone and the atmosphere today. Okay, so today we'll start with what is the atmosphere and how is it composed and what is it made out of. Okay, so here you have a lovely picture of the Earth from outer space, and then the atmosphere, we can see the clouds and various other components of it. But in this lesson, we'll try to see exactly what makes up the atmosphere and how it helps us to survive. So what is the atmosphere? It's a thin layer of gases, and it's a mixture of gases that surround the Earth's surface. Its composition has changed over billions of years due to several different things. Some from geological events, such as volcanoes and other release from within the Earth's core, as well as the development of life. So for students studying biology, you'll be familiar with how as life developed over the last 2 billion years, the atmosphere has also developed with it. So with the production of photosynthesis as a metabolic pathway, as well as the evolution of respiration, we've seen the Earth's atmosphere gradually change over the last 2 billion years. Now, because of the Industrial Revolution and the use of machinery, as well as fossil fuels, there has been increased concern over our activities negatively impacting our atmosphere. So in the case of the ozone layer, there's the chlorofluorocarbons and the ozone hole, as well as the human-induced climate change, which has become the central focus of many political debates as of now. Now there's increased evidence. Of course, we don't say these things because without evidence. And there's been an increased level of pollution monitored in the environment. So once again, chemical monitoring and management, why do we want to monitor these things? Well, here's one reason. So we've been able to see over the last 200, 300 years that nitrous oxide levels as well as sulfur dioxides have also increased, as well as carbon dioxide, since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Now these have negative impacts on our environment because of acid rain and other things, but we'll cover that in much more detail in future lessons. I mentioned before the destruction of the protective ozone layer by chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and there has been a pronounced ozone hole, so to speak, over the Antarctic that's been measured over the last 30 to 40 years. Again, increasing the need to monitor chemicals in our environment to see what damage they're doing to our environment. So what is the function of the atmosphere? So why do we need it, and how does it help us survive? So it supports us in a variety of ways, and one of them is it provides CO2, or carbon dioxide, for photosynthesis. So for those who have studied the photosynthetic process in biology or previously in earlier years of science, you'll know that carbon dioxide is a requirement for this process, and it produces oxygen as a byproduct. Now, because that oxygen is coming out, we have oxygen present in the atmosphere, which we as humans and other organisms require for respiration, which is the generation of energy by the conversion of glucose and oxygen into carbon dioxide. The atmosphere also provides us with nitrogen for nitrogen fixation. So within our bodies there are many compounds, and within all organisms there are many compounds, and one of the most important classes of compounds is the protein and the nucleic acid, which contain a large percentage of nitrogen. So we need to obtain that nitrogen from somewhere, and where it starts is the atmosphere, because the nitrogen present in the atmosphere is converted into useful nitrogen by other organisms, which we then absorb to produce these chemicals within our bodies. The atmosphere also supports the water cycle. So as you know, there's only a small amount of fresh water present on the planet, and so the atmosphere helps to transport this fresh water around, and through rain and other precipitations, we get fresh water. And lastly, we have the absorption of harmful UV radiation. So the sun bombards the Earth with several different types of radiation. However, the atmosphere helps to filter that so that life on this planet doesn't suffer any negative consequences. Additionally, it maintains the heat balance. So what that means is that the temperature of the Earth is essentially the same or stays constant. Now, it does this by absorbing the heat emitted from the Earth after it has been absorbed by the sun. And that is done through certain gases like water and carbon dioxide, as well as methane. As well, because there is so much air above us, it means that it sort of pushes down on us because of gravity. So the air above us pushes down, which is what we call air pressure. Now this pressure, while it's not essential for life, it has helped us develop in a particular direction. So the way my body is structured and other organisms are structured is designed by evolution in such a way to optimize the fact that we have a certain amount of pressure above us. So what is the composition of the atmosphere? I've mentioned that there are lots of components, lots of things in it, and what they do, but how much of it is there in the atmosphere is the question. So here we have a breakdown of the various components of the atmosphere. So the first one, nitrogen, is more than 3/4 of the atmosphere. So 78.1% of the atmosphere of the Earth is nitrogen. 20% or 21% almost is oxygen. So what we breathe in still only makes up just over 1/5 of the gases in the atmosphere. So that's oxygen. Argon, from your previous studies in chemistry, you should have understood that argon is a noble gas and is very unreactive, but it contributes almost 1% of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, a great fear of our post-industrial revolution days, something that we are worried is damaging our environment, still only makes up just less than 0.04%, so 0.038%. Other trace gases such as methane, helium and other things only make less than 0.01%. And water vapor makes up anywhere between 0 and 0.05% of dry air at ground level. Next, we have just a breakdown in a visual form, so a pie chart. And as you can see here, the vast majority is simply just nitrogen. Oxygen makes up the next biggest component, and a very, very tiny percentage is given to everything else. So these gases in the atmosphere, nitrogen and oxygen, I said, have made up most of it. The troposphere being part of the atmosphere. Again, this will be explained in future lessons. And together they represent about 99% of the composition of the air. So if you can imagine, what you're breathing in is mostly nitrogen and oxygen, with a very, very minor percentage being anything else. So why are these gases important? So oxygen in particular is important to us as humans because we require it for energy generation. So the process is called respiration. Again, if you have studied biology, you would know that this process, you would understand this process, but for the chemistry students, essentially what's happening is oxygen is coming into a cell of the body and mixing with glucose or sugars and generating water as well as carbon dioxide and energy. So sugars are broken down chemically to yield energy for living systems, which is essentially what I've just mentioned. And here's the reaction. So once again, glucose, which will represent as the chemical energy or sugars, oxygen are put into the system, and what comes out is carbon dioxide, water, and energy. This energy is in the form of more types of chemicals for the human body to absorb, but the main thing is that sugars and oxygen create carbon dioxide. In earlier studies, you would have done a study on combustion, and you'll recognize that this system is similar in a lot of ways to combustion. You take in a fuel, you mix it with oxygen, and you get carbon dioxide and water out, as well as energy. However, this is more of a slow kind of combustion, where the energy release is not so rapid. So with combustion, you see a lot of fire and a lot of heat and energy coming out, whereas in this, it's more of a controlled usage of that energy. Nitrogen. the biggest part of the atmosphere, as we've already mentioned, is very important for living organisms. So protein, which is a broad class of biological chemicals, require nitrogen to be formed. So nitrogen is an important aspect of the protein, and so biologically available nitrogen becomes extremely important. So most plants, which is where we get our nitrogen from to start with, because we consume plants and other animals, so most plants cannot produce nitrogen directly from the atmosphere. So if you think about this, nitrogen is a diatomic molecule, and so there's 2 atoms of nitrogen for every molecule of nitrogen gas that we see. So with those 2 atoms of nitrogen are bonded with triple bonds, which makes this a very, very strong and inert chemical. So it means that when we need it, it is rarely available to biological systems because it's just too strong to break down. However, there are means of getting nitrogen from the atmosphere, of course, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So we need to obtain them from ammonium and nitrate salts. And where we get these from, in a natural system, we get them from lightning. So lightning here is a very impressive natural phenomena. And what it does is, because there's so much energy in lightning, I'm sure you've seen and heard the thunder and all the various things associated with lightning, there's so much energy that it can break down that nitrogen and form nitrous oxides, which then mix with the water in the air, which, because lightning usually comes with rain, the rain will draw that nitrous oxide out of the air and it'll seep into the soil, which is now available for plants to absorb. There are some bacteria and blue-green algae that can actually have chemical compounds in their bodies that allow them to create biologically available nitrogen. And these are very useful to some plants called legumes, so beans, as they are present in the roots. So they'll suck up nitrogen from the air and produce available nitrogen for the plant. Lastly, in a non-natural sense, we as humans require fertilizer because we like to grow our crops in certain areas and we want to maximize those crop yields. So we produce fertilizers. So because of our knowledge of chemistry, we've developed ways to take out nitrogen from the air and put it into a new compound, which we can then use as a fertilizer. So we just spoke about oxygen and nitrogen, the 2 major components. Now argon is the other major component, which is still less than 1%. But we'll talk about carbon dioxide because argon is a little bit inert, or it's actually very inert. So it doesn't really affect us as living organisms. Now carbon dioxide makes up even less than argon, so even less than 1%, so 0.038% of the atmosphere. Yet it is very useful to plants, as well as it causes some issue for the living system as a whole. Now, when I said it's useful for plants, it's useful mainly because you manufacture glucose in the photosynthetic process, so in the process of photosynthesis. Biology students, if you've studied photosynthesis, this should all be a recap of what you've already done. But for chemistry students, here's the equation for you, if you haven't already seen it. Now, you take in carbon dioxide as a plant, and you put water and energy, and you get glucose, which is this molecule, and oxygen out. Now, when you think about how to take care of plants, you put them outside where they have access to air. You put water on their roots so they have water and they don't dry out. And there's some energy related to that you put in to make this reaction go. Now, if you look at this process compared to respiration, it's very much the reverse process of respiration. So these 2 chemicals are required for respiration, sugar and oxygen, whereas these 2 chemicals come out, which means that when you have plants and animals together, there's a nice loop going where one output from, say, the animal gives input to the plant and vice versa. Now, this energy that we're talking about is from sunlight. So we obviously put plants outdoors. They don't really like to be indoors, and they don't really like to be in the dark. So sunlight is the required energy. And over millions of years, plants have developed very strong adaptations to maximize their photosynthesis process. Now, if you think about this word photosynthesis, photo means, well, to me, always implies light, and synthesis means to make or to create. So using light to create something, which in this case is sugar. Now, this wraps up our study of the composition of the atmosphere, as well as the function of the gases within the atmosphere. So we'll move on to some questions to help us to see some applications of this and how to reinforce all the things that we've learned in the previous 10 minutes. So firstly, which of the following is not a task performed by our atmosphere? So when we look back on all of the things that we've done previously, just then, we'll see various support functions that the atmosphere does. So let's go through each point and we'll see which one's the correct answer. So A, pressurizing the environment is incorrect. This is something that the atmosphere does for us. It pressurizes our living environment, which is on the land, because it pushes down on us because we're standing on the ground and there's air on top, which pushes down. So the atmosphere obviously provides pressure, so this is incorrect. Now, B, supports the water cycle is also incorrect. As I mentioned before, the clouds and water vapor in the atmosphere provide or support the continuation of the water cycle. So when the clouds and the vapor are present, winds and other atmospheric phenomena push them around and help to transport that water to where it's maybe not needed, but where it ends up. And that helps to support this water cycle. So this is obviously also incorrect. D, again, incorrect. I mentioned that the Earth's heat balance, or the temperature consistency of the planet, is kept in check by the atmosphere. And so think gases like carbon dioxide, as well as methane and water, help to prevent heat from escaping our planet, which helps to keep our temperature fairly constant over a very long geological time. So lastly, we have C, deflecting ionizing radiation, and this one is correct. So the Earth's atmosphere absorbs UV radiation, which is true, that helps us, but it's the Earth's magnetic field which deflects these ionizing radiations that come from the sun. So while the Earth's atmosphere does filter some of the radiation, a lot of the deflection of ionizing radiation is done by the Earth's magnetic field, which makes this one the most correct answer. If that makes sense, we can move on to question 2, which is, what is the main constituent of the atmosphere at ground level? So by main constituent, I mean, what is the biggest component? Is it A, water? No, because we've mentioned that water at ground level only composes 0.05% or even 0% of the gases in the atmosphere. So that's incorrect. Oxygen, which is again incorrect, because like I said, only almost 21% of the gases in the atmosphere are oxygen, so that can't be true either. Carbon dioxide, again, incorrect, even though its effect is very pronounced, and having increased numbers of carbon dioxide are not good for the environment, it still only makes up 0.038%, which is extremely small. So lastly, we have C, which is the correct answer, nitrogen. As I mentioned, nitrogen makes up 78.1% of the gases in the atmosphere, which is more than 3/4. So again, if this is okay, we'll move on to question 3, which is, which gas is used by plants in the manufacture of glucose? So this process, we look back at the various things that we've talked about, which in this case, specifically photosynthesis. So here's our diagram. So we have water, which is not a gas, which comes in, light, which is also not a gas, and finally we have carbon dioxide, which is a gas. So carbon dioxide is used during the photosynthetic process. So if we look at this equation, we have carbon dioxide is as a gas, water as a liquid, and it turns into this sugar molecule. Again, biology students will be well aware of how all this works. For the chemistry students who have never seen this before, familiarize yourself with this process because it will continue to come up in all areas in most of the other aspects of chemistry as well. If there are any problems, don't hesitate to ask, but we'll move on if this is okay. So, what is the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? We just mentioned that in the previous couple of questions, so we should be able to answer this. But to help, we have this pie chart. So again, here it is, 0.038%, the small, very, very small percentage of the atmosphere. And that's your answer. Now, this is the more interesting question in that explain why this percentage is so low, given that carbon dioxide is released during respiration. So plants and animals all respire. There's millions upon billions of organisms living, and they're all breathing out carbon dioxide. So why is this number still so very, very small? And then, so to answer that, we look at how the respiration process and the photosynthetic process interact with one another. So as I mentioned, carbon dioxide released by respiration is absorbed again during photosynthesis because of that nicely closed loop system. So when you release carbon dioxide, you get a plant nearby which will absorb it, which will then keep the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere very low. So moving on to question 5. If the Earth's atmosphere contained no oxygen, would any form of life be able to exist? So again, biology students, you should have seen some other forms of life that don't require oxygen. One of them is yeast. So bread and wine are both created with yeast, and they don't require oxygen to survive. But one of the biggest classes of organisms that don't require oxygen is, of course, plants. So as long as there are sufficient quantities of nitrogen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then there's no need to respire at all. As long as they can continue the photosynthetic process, they don't need to respire. So nitrogen and carbon dioxide, as long as there's enough, plants can survive without oxygen. So there are many classes of organisms that can survive without oxygen. So this wraps up this lesson for today. We've studied the composition of the atmosphere as well as its function in a biological system. In particular, studying what the gases do for living organisms on the planet. Next lesson, we'll talk about the structure of the atmosphere and how its structure and layers help to maintain life on Earth, as well as seeing how the atmosphere how we are affecting the atmosphere as humans. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next lesson.